All right, hello everyone. How are we doing today? So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we are just going to go ahead and record this lecture on the 1950s so that everyone has the ability to hear this lecture to get ready for the exam that's going to be coming up later this week. So the 1950s was this important decade for causing a lot of changes in terms of how Americans were feeling about the economy. One of the things that's going to happen is that many people started to have more children at this time because the economy was doing so well. So one of the things we need to really pay attention to is what was happening during the 1950s that created this confidence in a lot of Americans, and this confidence for them to have more children at this time. Um, so we'll dive into that. We'll also take a look at how did the Soviet satellite Sputnik change educational priorities in the United States. We're going to investigate why the interstate system was important to the development of suburbs. And finally, we're going to look at why were the beat poets opposed to the consumerism of the 1950s. So these are all important points, but most of them are related to this idea of post-war prosperity, about the fact that Americans are making a lot of money in the time period after World War II. So these are some key terms that I think you guys should know for the exam that is going to be coming up. Be sure you understand what baby boom is, know the GI Bill of Rights, suburbs, the growth of the middle class, Sputnik, the Beat Generation, and the Interstate Highway Act. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7 are all related to each other. The reason why the suburbs are growing is because there are interstates that connect suburbs to urban areas where people were working primarily. People were moving out to the suburbs to buy bigger houses. So, because they were having more kids as a result of the baby boom, and people were having better paying jobs because they had access to low interest loans that allowed them to go to college and start their businesses that were created and started by the GI Bill of Rights. So you can see how a lot of these ideas are related to each other. Sputnik as well is related in a sense, but it primarily starts off as this movement. Sputnik started off a completely different type of movement, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So here's a video that you can watch on your own at your own leisure. So that's just something to take a look at. But something we need to focus on is why were Americans feeling confident in the post-war period, and primarily stems from the fact that the GI Bill of Rights passed, or that there was this new law that was created, that was passed called the GI Bill of Rights, and this law provided assistance for veterans to afford to go to college, to purchase or construct a home, fund a farm, or start a business. So now Americans had access to these loans, and people could go to college, which before had been pretty much just for upper middle class to fairly wealthy people. But now you have Americans who can afford to go to college, and they're able to get good white collar jobs, and they're able to um, eventually live off of just one income. And there are all sorts of benefits that happen as a result of the GI Bill of Rights. It really just improves society in many different ways. It creates this confidence that people can live off of one paycheck and that they can start to have raised families at a younger age. So the 1950s, as a result of people going to college, getting better paying jobs, led to a demand for more homes, more cars, all sorts of things like that. So now there is this sense of security in which a family could live off of one paycheck, afford a home at a younger age, and all of these factors really encouraged couples to marry at a younger age, which gave them more time to have more children. So now you're seeing people getting married when they are 22 years old, just fresh out of college, rather than waiting a long time for them to become solvent and for them to be able to have more money to own a home and do all sorts of things like that. Here's a reading that you can look at as well. And this is just a bar graph to really give you a sense of the massive change that was happening at this time. So as you can see, in 1940, there were just a little over 2.5 million live births, but by 1956-57, This is when we're almost getting up to 4.5 million births per year. So we're just seeing tremendous growth happen at this time. And it's something that we really need to pay attention to, because when we're looking at this increase in births, we're seeing an increase in the economy. So, and all of these things are related to each other. So job security and comfort led people to having children at a younger age. People having more children meant that they wanted to live in a bigger home, that they needed an extra car. So not only were white collar workers making a lot of money at this time, but contractors who are building homes are making a lot of money. Um, auto People working in auto manufacturing businesses are making a lot of money now. So that people are just making a lot of money and feeling very confident and proud of being Americans because of how well the economy is doing and how comfortable people are, especially after they had just endured World War II, where many of them were worried about loved ones who were fighting abroad, and there were many rations as well during this time. So the economy is increasing because people have good paying jobs, they're having more children, and they're paying more to support and take care of their families. So things are going pretty well for the United States, except for in one key area. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the first nation to really kick off the space race and um, uh, to land the first punch as well when they successfully launched Sputnik into outer space. Sputnik was a satellite that was not that big and pretty not that special either. It just had like a beep. It would just make like a beeping sound in it. But what it represented was something very significant. So in 1957, when the Soviet Union successfully launched the satellite into Earth's orbit, um, it meant that now the Soviet Union had the technology possible to continue to develop sending things into orbit and to potentially create missiles that they could launch into outer space, and then they would come back down and hit the United States. And at that point, it'd be pretty much impossible for the United States to defend itself against this type of an attack. So America realized that they couldn't just focus on the arms race anymore, but really needed to spend more time developing their own space program as well. So a lot of the uh, technological innovations at this time and a lot of the resources and educational priorities start going into STEM so that the United States can continue to develop its space program and to keep up with the Russians. So the United States starts spending a lot of money on its space program. It starts focusing on all sorts of things related to this, funding colleges to develop engineers that could figure out how to get satellites up into space. And that's what they're primarily focusing on at this point. So the United States and Soviet Union are really upping the ante. They are thinking about the scale of what they could do. And the Soviet Union had already figured out how to launch a satellite into space. So they wanted to see if they could launch a living thing into space as well. And that's where this picture comes from. This is a picture of a dog named Laika, who was a stray dog that the Russian government found on the streets, and they put her into a space capsule and wanted to see if she would survive the launch. And surprisingly, they theoretically believed that nothing could survive, going up into orbit. And yet this dog was still alive. It was barking, it was alive, so they realized that potentially they could send people out into space as well after conducting various tests. Unfortunately, Laika did not survive. Um, she ran out of oxygen in her uh, in her tube, and then she also did not survive impact after her shuttle re-entered orbit. So just another reason why we should not like the Russians, just because to kill this little dog. But America was still working on developing its satellite. In 1958, they launched Explorer 1 just a year after Sputnik. So America started to keep up with the Russians at this point. So you can go ahead, take a look at that survey. I want to make a quick note on politics because some of you might be interested in what the presidency and politics looked like at this time. So from post 1945 until 1964, Republicans and Democrats were very moderate and focused primarily on foreign Cold War policy. Democrats did not push for progressive legislation, and Republicans were not concerned with being fiscally conservative. So that's kind of how we usually think about the parties: is that one side is composed of fiscal conservatives, and the other side is more progressive and more liberal with spending. But at this time, everyone was focused primarily on how to prevent the spread of communism. So they were all Cold Warriors that sought to prevent the spread of communism and to protect the Earth, or to protect America from any potential attacks. So that's the reason why Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican president, decided to fund the Interstate Highway Act, because this was also known as the Defense Highways Act. The main purpose of this was not only to help interstate commerce, to help people move things around the country, but it was primarily to help the military move efficiently throughout the country to any major city to help in the event of a disaster or an attack. So if something bad happened in Dallas, people would be able to get there quickly to help rebuild the city. If the Soviet Union launched an attack on New York City, the military could quickly get there in less than a day. Or if China or someone like that attacked Los Angeles, they could get to the other side of America relatively quickly. So this is something that allowed for America to defend itself by creating a more efficient route for the military to get to a variety, almost any major city. But this system also had many additional benefits. So it had the defense angle to it, but it was also contributing to the rise of suburbs. So the reason why suburbs could actually exist is because of the interstate system. Suburbs function because the land is so cheap. Typically, that's where there would be a lot of farmland and stuff like that that would be really inexpensive. And so these areas that were just covered in grass and that previously had been farmland were now turning into neighborhoods almost overnight. So if you think about what is happening on 380, if you're leaving Denton and heading east on 380 towards McKinney, you're able to see so many different housing developments. And the reason why is because that land is so cheap that people could buy up massive amounts of land, just giant tracts of land, and build new houses on top of it in these new suburbs. And so people then could just hop on the highway, or could hop on the highway and get to work. So now it's much easier for a person if they were in Little Elm to get to Dallas, or from Frisco to get to Dallas, than before, because before people would have to travel on county roads and county highways rather than just hopping on I-35 and going where they needed to get to. So now people, because of the interstate system, can live in these areas outside of various cities, and such as in this example, which was Levittown in Long Island. That's where a lot of people in New York moved to because they could afford to buy houses out on Long Island. So this was pretty much like um, the very first suburb, and people were able to move into these suburbs and have modern appliances and luxuries that before would not have been possible in cities, such as they could have a refrigerator, a yard, air conditioning, so many nice things that people really desired, and that encouraged them to move out there, and because they knew that the commute would be relatively easy as well. So now we can see how this new American dream really started, because the baby boom was started from the GI Bill. People had good jobs in cities. They, were able to save up some money, and by the time that the interstate system was started and completed, people were already moving out into suburbs and could live farther and farther distances away from the cities where they were working. And so now we see that there's this new American dream where most families now own two cars, they survived on a single paycheck, men commuted to work, and women stayed home to take care of their kids. So just really interesting way to think about how this idea of the American dream really started, about the house with the picket fence, couple of kids, dog. This is where that idea really came from and why it became a reality, at least for white middle class families. So things were going so well for the United States that eventually there was this thing called the kitchen debate where Nikita Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union, came to the United States and Vice President Richard Nixon debated him over the goodness of capitalism because Nixon was able to point out that the average family now could have air conditioning in their home, that they could have a washer and dryer, that they could have eventually a dishwasher as well. And all of these modern appliances became standard for the American way of life. And so this is just demonstrating that capitalism allowed all of these luxuries to become available to almost everyone who wanted them in America. And yet there were groups that were opposed to this system. So please be sure to watch this video on the Nearpod lecture. It's all about the Beat Generation. It's all about, uh, goodness gracious, apologize for this typo. Yeah, if you watch it, it's all about how the Beat Generation started off with this countercultural movement that people were opposed to, but there was this movement that was opposed to the materialism of this time period, and that people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg were against the fact that Americans were so obsessed with the materials of this time, that they were so obsessed with having a house, having a car, with all of these modern comforts, and also obsessed with the arms race, that they thought that this was leading to the decline of America. They believed that uh, people who were becoming too materialistic were losing their souls, that they were losing what made America great. And so they were so much more interested in art, in travel, and having a wider experience, and not being so into what America was proud of, but instead they were really into um, more about limiting the arms race and about trying to prevent the growth of um, the growth of military and materialism. So this was a countercultural movement, and it just shows that not everyone was in agreement with what was happening in the United States at this time. So this just gives you a sense that this was a time of great prosperity, but that this was also a time of fear where Americans had to keep up with the Soviet Union because of the space race, and that there were also individuals that were opposed to what was happening, that the Beat Generation was opposed to America at this time, or was opposed to the materialism of this time as well. All right. Thank you so much. I hope that this helps, and please let me know if you have any questions.